Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second class. This second class, compared with the previous one, it's a little bit more complex in terms of theoretical discussion. If in the first class we have seen the generation and development of the early stage of the modernist architecture, which is a consequence of the change of the time, the change of the society, the change of the technologies, and the new needs of the human being in terms of living condition. In this second class, the situation becomes much more complex, philosophically complex, I mean. The early stage of the 20th century in the development of architecture have demonstrated the great talent of some fundamental master, something like Frank Lloyd Wright, but also Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and some great genius like Hans Scharoun, and so on. Those people are definitely the master of modernists, and they create a new methodology, new approach, completely different from the past in terms of design, style, language, and even the sense of the space. Their philosophy was very pragmatic, was very concrete. Their intention was to create a new method, new space, new form of living for the new generation, for a society which was radically changed after the Industrial Revolution and, unfortunately, also after the First World War. We terminate our first class with the discussion about the Second World War. Now, in Europe, but not only in Europe, basically in every part of the world, the Second World War was a real tragedy, probably one of the most devastating situations in the whole century. It has an immense number of casualties, incredible losses of economy, and the world after the Second World War, it is not the same anymore. We have seen at the same time some architects which passed through the Second World War and become important personality in the architecture in the post-war period. People like Walter Gropius, for example, but also Le Corbusier, even Frank Lloyd Wright, who was the oldest in between the great master, but also Hans Scharoun, Adalberto Libera, and many others. They simply continued their career before and after the Second World War. Their methodology, basically, it is the same. It was a constant. They didn't change radically compared with their approach before the war. They can be called the late modernist. Somehow, they didn't change so much in terms of generation of architecture. The quality of architecture become better, maybe change, they become much more mature, and some of their masterpieces were created after the Second World War, for example, like in the case of Hans Scharoun, but also in the case of Luigi Moretti. Many architects simply continue the same methodology that they have approached before the war. So, in conclusion, we can assure that those people are still modernist architecture, late modernist architecture. But can we say that the architecture did not change before and after the war? No, we cannot assert like that. Before and after the Second World War, the environment was completely changed. The society was changed, the philosophy, the approach, the methodology, even the trust in the science was very different. And this is why we have divided our class in everything before the Second World War and everything after the Second World War. The Second World War was the age of big change. During the 50s, a lot of new philosophy come out, new methodology, new approaches come out. For the first time, there is the use of advanced mathematics and calculation in architecture. For the first time, there is a very strong involvement of social discussion in architecture. we know very well that the relationship in between social and architecture is not a new matter. For example, all the debate about the phalansters in France and in US during the 19th century was exactly in this direction. The question was in which way the social situation, the social organization can be reflected in architecture, and vice versa. How the architecture can be an expression, can be generate eventually a new form of society. So social and architecture was strictly related to each other. This is a very important statement, very important point. It was original in 19th century. It was a constant trend for all 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. We did remember the case of Olivetti, but also Siemens, which create standardized apartment for the workers in the factory. Somehow we can assert that the social matter was a kind of constant element in all the history of 19th and 20th century. But during the 1950s, this case become much more radical, much more important. This is one of the core of the discussion in this second class. It's not a case that the scholar call the post-war period not anymore modernity, but it started to become, propose a new definition, new names, which is called structuralism, and then post-structuralism. And then finally, all this post-structuralism flow into the post-modernity and the constructivism, which is probably one of the core of this class. The intention of this class, it is to introduce the changes in terms of society, in terms of methodology, in terms of philosophy, in between the modernity and the post-modernity. Why it exists, this radical change in between modernity and something else? Very good. Probably a very strong reason is the distrust in front of the rationality, in front of the science, in front of the strict methodology of the modernity. Why? It's very clear. The architecture of the modernity, the methodology of the modernity, not only in architecture, but generally speaking in all the branch of the human being, generate the war. Yes, because the same method which was used for the workers' apartment, the same logic, the same strict method which generate architecture for the human being, architecture generated by a rationality, cheap, fast, and beautiful, and with a high standard of hygiene. Well, the same method was used for the creation of the concentration camp in Germany and in many other countries in the world. Somehow there is a strong distrust because, yes, if the first part of 20th century has a very big hope, a very strong motivation in front of the rationality, but that rationality generated war, that rationality generated dictatorship, that rationality killed around 60 million of people only in Europe. And this is not good. So the people start to have a distrust in front of one method, in front of one system, which, yes, create modern city, yes, generate good and healthy architecture, more light, more appropriate for their time, but at the same time, the same cultural environment, the same logic, the same process, the same industrial production which was used for the creation of architecture, exactly the same situation generate the architecture of the dictatorship, generated the concentration camp, generated the systematic mass destruction process. So the people was very tired, was completely lost in front of the future. That method doesn't work anymore. And so what? There is the necessity of creation of a new system, new order, new process of life. And that is the big discussion around the 1950s. So a new methodology came out. Probably one of the most influential was what is called structuralism. The structuralism is a very interesting and very difficult philosophy, which was created with the strong contribution of the French sociologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, which is one of the fathers of the structuralism. This discipline is extremely complex. I don't have any authority to describe the structuralist philosophy, but I want to keep the key element in the structuralism. What does it mean? The word structuralism included the concept of structure. Somehow, philosopher, architect, mathematician, physicist, everyone was deeply involved in the research of the structures of everything. What does it mean? You can think about your own body. It has a sort of structures. For example, the backbones is the structures of your body. But this is a visible structures. There are also invisible structures. For example, the structures of your own family. And in general, is your own family different from any other family? Probably they have their own specific character. But in general, what the philosophers were interested in is to find the universal structures in everything. So, if concerned, for example, the structures of the family, the key question was not the research of the structures of my family or your family, but the structures, the general rule of every possible family, of every possible society. So it's a sort of superstructures. It's a sort of universal rule which can explain every form of families. It is a madness, it is the research of an utopia, but in part yes, because the universal rule of everything, it is very difficult to find. It's not so easy. For example, the famous theory of everything, which the physicist is going to research in physics, it is one goal. It is a sort of research of the human being to find the universal rule of everything. Does it exist? Does not exist? I have no idea about it. But the human beings are constantly in the research of those universal rules. The structuralism intend to find some key element in the structures of the universe, include society. Now, because architecture and cities are created to satisfy the needs of the human being, then, consequentially, those needs have to be precisely categorized, precisely investigated. Because a house, in the modernity, it is not only four walls, one roof, one floor, and some hole called windows and doors. There are a lot of interesting speculation, a lot of interesting experiment. In the first half of 20th century, the architecture became dynamic, followed the rule of physics, interpreted the theory of relativity of Einstein, something like the case of Erich Mendelssohn. It is deeply in touch with the nature, like the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. They have a very complicated structures in terms of engineering, something like the work of Maillard or Eiffel. Somehow, those kind of philosophy generate architecture with a high level of speculation, high level of theory. But now, with the work of the structuralist architect, this work become even more universal, more general. And why? Because the society need new rule. The previous methodology of the modernism, it was not so good. it was not so interesting, because the problem in this case is that work, it is not trustable anymore. The modernity generates monster, and so it is necessary to create new form of methodology to create new society. The society of the Second World War, the post-war period, was very different compared with the society of the previous age. There is no trust anymore. There is no economy anymore. All the cities were destroyed, and it was necessary to create a new method, new approach to generate new cities. For example, Berlin was completely destroyed in Germany. For example, London. For example, many cities of Europe. Dresden. Many cities was completely wiped out. So, how to regenerate the cities? And that is the question. Can we use the methodology of the modernism? No thanks, because that kind of methodology generates monster. We need a new method, and the structuralism generates a very powerful system of creation of architecture. Not only. I repeat once again that the structuralism was a methodology for everything. There are structuralism in social study, in language, in mathematics, in computer science, in architecture, in urban planning, in relationship in between human beings. Somehow, the structuralism is the new process of that age. The remarkable work of Claude Lévi-Strauss indicate a very precise method and a very powerful one, because here the result was quite correct. It was very interesting. It makes a school. His work was fundamental for almost half century. So, the structuralism was adopted by several disciplines, include architecture. Now, what is the relationship in between structuralism in philosophy and structuralism in architecture? We will investigate better in the second part of the second lesson. But for now, I just want to give a very small example. When you design a house, an apartment, or a factory, or whenever, or a city, even better example, you have to consider different function, and you have to consider who is going to use that function. For example, in the case of one apartment, you must consider who is going to use the apartment. A single person, a couple, a family, a large family, a clan, or something different, something like the socialist community in 19th century. It is evident that different people have different needs, and different social organizations require different standard and different logic and different function. An industrial city, for example, it is radically different compared with an historical city in terms of use and structures and planning. Or, for example, a casino, or a school, or a factory, they have a completely different needs. So, consequentially, the form and the function have to be different. This is why the structuralism in architecture investigate, firstly, the structures of the society, the structures of the clan, the group, the people who have to use that architecture, and only after generate architecture. For example, if we are going to design an apartment for a single person, or for a couple, or for a family with the parents and two children, definitely the social relationship inside the family are different. A single person is completely independent. A family with 2 or 3 children and parents and maybe grandparents, they have a social dynamic much more different. This kind of dynamic, this kind of structures, here we are, have to be considered to design the apartment. The apartment should be a reflection of the social structures of the family or the group of people who is going to use that apartment. The things become much more complicated, for example, if we investigate, if we have to design or investigate a town or a city or a megalopolis, that the complexity becomes really huge. Huge, difficult, very complicated, but we must do the job. We cannot simply give up and let the city or the district or the village growth without any control. That is completely a disaster. So one of the positions of this structuralist philosophy is to analyze the complexity and the dynamic inside the society in order to understand how the society works, how the family works, how the city in terms of social relationship work, and then consequentially generate a project which answer or at least respect those kind of high-level complexity. It is logic that the structuralism become very, very popular at that time. And apparently this is good. So the investigation about the structures of a system, family, city, work relationship, definitely is a good point in order to have a better design of a building or something else. The structuralism become very, very important, for example, in the very early step of the computer science. Everything it is based on structure. But the old sentence say, where is the apple, there is also a bug. The structuralism become very rigid and very complicated. Because if we are going to investigate the structures of a family, well, it is simple in terms of create the relationship in between family members. But if we are going to investigate the structures of the universe, that is much more difficult. Because that was the intention of the structuralist philosophy, to investigate, to find out the superstructures of everything, and that is much more controversial. Now I'm making the structuralist philosophy very simple, but the essential point is that structures of everything. And even if you have a very precise description of the structures of a family, a group, a city, this doesn't mean that the quality of the project is good. In fact, there are a lot of projects generated by the structuralist philosophy, which was really a disaster in terms of quality of living condition. Some are good, but some are very bad. And both of them follow strictly the methodology of the structuralist philosophy. So, somehow the structuralism, yes, it is a very good weapon, but it depends who used the weapon. A brush is a very good tool in the hand of Rembrandt or Leonardo da Vinci, but in the hand of common people, the result is a disaster. It is the same for the structuralist philosophy. The structuralist methodology generates a really masterpiece of architecture, and we will investigate the case in the second part of this class of Hermann Herzberger. That is really a good architecture. But if we investigate the result of, for example, Ellison and Peter Smithson, even in the importance in the history of architecture of those two very remarkable authors, the result maybe are controversial. I wish to don't live in their house. Their creation was too theoretical. But there is something worse. The structuralist philosophy generates structures. So it means that many architects, especially during the 1960s and 1970s, throw themselves inside superstructures, what it is called in the history of architecture megastructures or superstructures. In that case, the architecture become only speculation, only experiment in modularity, superstructures in architecture. And that was really a madness, was a kind of utopia. Very funny, very funky. I adore that period. It is one of my expertise. I simply enjoy the design of these macro structures made by hundreds of architects. But maybe the final result was, if we want to use a sweet words, controversial. If we want to use the right words, it was a madness. Because the structuralism assumed that if we respect the structures of a society, then the application necessarily was good. But it wasn't at the end. Because of the structuralist architecture, we will investigate later in the part 2 of this class again, generate modularity system. It means generate a sort of method, a kind of a kind of system of aggregation of cells, which have to be repeated endless. For example, the work of Gunther Dominic, for example, was deeply involved in this kind of superstructures. There are also other experiments made by other authors, even more famous, something like the archigram. But archigram is a very special trend. It's not really structuralist. It's something very unique. We will describe later and better in the following class. Anyway, this kind of macro structures were system of aggregation of a simple cell into a much bigger frame. Probably the most important architect in this kind of trend is the Japanese Kenzo Tange. Kenzo Tange, which is one of the most remarkable architects in the whole 20th century, he generated brutalist architecture, magnificent work, very strong, sometimes not very well, the result was not successful, but definitely a great designer. But what it is very important is, for example, the plan for the Bay of Tokyo. That project was based on superstructures. And it is really controversial, very poetic, very imaginative, a masterpiece of visionary. But if it becomes real, it is simply the destroyment of the old Tokyo Bay, the destruction of a natural environment. So the structuralist architecture is sometimes not really successful in terms of application, but it is definitely a challenge of the human intellect. The structuralism methodology imply structures. But are we sure that the structures are the medicine for everything, the panacea for all the sickness of the world? Well, exactly because the world become extremely complex during the development of the second part of the 20th century, finally the structures start to be a little bit too rigid for the human society. According with some scholar, according with the philosophy, everything has a structures. Can be hidden, can be clear, can be flexible, but there is always a structures and a logic over every possible system. But some discoveries in science and some social conflict in the society, especially during the 1960s, demonstrate to the world that the structures, yes, exist, but there is something else. And then finally, a lot of discoveries in science, for example, demonstrate that no, there is no structures in the deep of the nature. The situation becomes a little bit more complicated now, because we must touch some element in advanced mathematics and in physics. But I want to quote only two very important and fundamental cases. The first one is the mathematics of René Thom, which investigate the chaos in mathematics. This mathematician is not really very famous for the large public, but it is quite important in mathematics because he studied the cuspid, the crisis in mathematics. And according with his calculation, according with his speculation in mathematics, he demonstrated that there are states which cannot be described clearly at the very beginning, which it means. The chaos, attention, it doesn't mean randomness. The chaos means if we put initial data into a system, the final output cannot be imagined at the beginning. So the final output, it is always a sort of unpredictable situation. And this because of the nature of the system, not for mistakes of calculation or because the data are incorrect. The system itself, it is too complex, or better, his own nature is unpredictable. There is a very funny example on this case. If you hit a ball, if you know very precisely the condition of the environment, the power of the hitting, the wind, the weight of the ball, and so on, you can predict very precisely the trajectory of the ball. But if you hit a dog, you can't. This is a typical funny, it is a joke, but it's a typical example for the unpredictable situation. The scientists demonstrate that there are a sort of system called Dissipative System where the chaos is deeply rooted, it is inherent to the system, and there is no way on the universe to find what is the final result, even if we know precisely all the conditions at the beginning. And then it is a big revolution, because every theory concerning the structuralism collapses. The structuralism implies that there is always a structure, complicated, hidden, somehow very difficult to find, but there is a structure that we can finally investigate. And these structures explain the nature of every possible system, with a variation, with modification, with exception, but there is a superstructures. In the dissipative system and in the mathematics of chaos of René Thom, this situation collapses. Even if we know the superstructures, the final result could be completely unpredictable. And this is the very beginning of the post-structuralist society. It was a period of big change. For example, there are very beautiful documentaries over internet with the description of the social conflict in US and Europe during the 1950s and 1960s. Because the people who argue against the society of their time find that the structures of the family, the structures of the country, the state, the government, organization, and so on, was not appropriate anymore for the needs of the young generation. So, partially for science, partially for physics, mathematics, and so on, partially for the social situation, the structuralism philosophy definitely collapsed for something else, which is called post-structuralism. And the post-structuralism is extremely complicated because finally flow into what it is called deconstructivism. And here start a very big headache. Why I say that the deconstruction is a big headache? Because it's true. The philosophy of deconstructivism starts from the speculation and the remarkable work of Jacques Derrida. Of course, there are some authors earlier than Derrida who took inspiration, but he can be considered the father of the deconstruction without any doubt. What does assert the deconstruction? Very difficult. The deconstruction asserts that every system, which basically it is coherent, which basically it is extremely solid, has inside the contradiction, which is deeply rooted, inherent the system itself. Every form of interpretation or understanding of the world, it is based only on interpretation or on interpretation. There is no anymore some strong thought, some strong philosophy, some universal thought which is able to explain the nature of the universe. But, on the contrary, there are only interpretation of interpretation, and everything is the interpretation of another interpretation. That's it. This is a radical change compared with the traditional philosophy. Every form of ancient philosophy, from the metaphysics to the Greek philosophy and whenever you want to say, it was based on strong assertion. The universe, the reality, the truth is what I'm going to say, or what God say, or what the prophets say. And that is a statement that cannot be discussed. Eventually can be verified or can be denied by other philosophy. And this is the history of the philosophy, a continued interpretation and assertion about a strong philosophy which assert a certain kind of vision of the universe. But the deconstruction give up. The deconstruction, if there is one message clear in the deconstruction, is exactly this. There is no universal philosophy, there is no strong thought, but everything it is only interpretation, and everything it is based on fragment and contradiction. This is a strong lesson from the deconstruction. Now, the book of Jacques Derrida and other philosophy, post-structuralist and deconstructivist philosophy, they are extremely difficult to understand because they are very complex in terms of language. So I warmly recommend to be very careful to read those essays. I did. I understand just a little bit to understand the key point of the deconstruction, I hope. But probably the biggest lesson that the deconstruction can give to the architects and also to the artists is this. Because there is no fundamental truth in the universe, but only interpretation, but only partial vision, everything collapses into fragment. Everything is composed by fragment. If in the past, to give an example, to give a metaphor, if in the past the reality can be seen into a bright mirror, in this moment the mirror is broken. It's broken in thousands of pieces. And what you can see through these pieces? Fragment of the reality. Every single fragment of the mirror shows a partial reality. But the reality itself, unified, unique, universal, established forever, doesn't exist anymore. Everything is based on fragment. And here starts the strong link in between deconstruction and architecture. For a certain historical coincidence, some philosophers of the deconstruction were in touch with architects. And the architects started to interpret the spirit of the time, what before called Zeitgeist, a German term very important in philosophy but also in art. The Zeitgeist, which means the spirit of the time. The architect and the artist are always interpret of their time. A great architect is not the one who generates a building which works. That is trivial. The architect interprets the reality with his work. So every architecture is an expression of their time. The same for the artist. Generally speaking, the painter and sculptor, they anticipate the future time. The architect just follow the trend. And this is why some key architects, something like, for example, Frank Gehry, Zaha Hadid, Libeskind, Copy Blau, but also the postmodernist architecture, something like Robert Venturi, Philip Johnson, Charles Moore, Michael Graves, that we investigate in the following chapter. All those people with a different formal interpretation, with a different vision, with different style and language, they interpret this idea of fragment. The history It is just a big can where we can take our formal element and combine together randomly, we can say. For example, the construction and the postmodernist architecture, they are very different in their formal aspect, but finally, at the very end, they both work with irony and fragment. Now, there is a big discussion at that time between 1980 and 1990, and it seems that the postmodernist and the deconstruction architecture were one the opposite of the other. One is the bad guy, another is the good guy, and they fight. And the discussion and argumentation was very sharp at the time. But then finally, beside the formal expression, the philosophy which move both of them are not really different. This is the general discussion about the scenario in between 1950, or better, after the Second World War, and the 1990s, more or less. In the following part of the lesson 2, we will investigate some examples of architecture which express clearly those concepts.